Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to that session that is dedicated to the Middle East and Syria, Middle East in general, but we'll speak about different issues. We hope it will be an interesting session. I will, with your permission, speak English because the majority of the people that are present in the room understand the language. Just a couple of words before we switch to our prominent speakers. In the papers in front of me, say that recently Russia has drastically augmented its influence in the Middle East, and one of the reasons of such a capability to augment its influence was the capability, the flexibility of its politics, and its openness, Russia's openness to dialogue with all partners, meaning that there is no dogmatism in Russia's stance in the Middle East, and indeed we are ready to talk with everyone. Just to give you an example, I think that Russia is the only country who speaks with all parties involved in Syrian conflict, with the exception of terrorists, of course, Al-Qaeda and Daesh. We, of course, cooperate with the Syrian government, but also with the Syrian political opposition, military opposition on the ground. We talk with all foreign players, be it the West, the US, and a good example is the Russian-US negotiations on Eastern Aleppo that took place in 2016. Then we talk to Israel and Iran, with Saudi Arabia and Qatar, with United Emirates, Egypt, with all parties. This is an important feature of Russian foreign policy, and it's called pragmatism. Pragmatism is very important, a very important feature of a policy of any country in this world of emerging multipolarism. Multipolar world means, and there is a lot of talk about that the new international system that is emerging will have a lot of power centers, if I may. And these centers of power each of them have its own interest and readiness to project its influence. And it's very important in this contemporary world to be able to get rid of any dogmatism and to speak with everyone. And I hope that Russia succeeds. Russia is permanent member of Security Council. Russia is a member of Astana process, Russia, Turkey and Iran. And Russia is member of International Syria Support Group, which deals with humanitarian and these ceasefire issues in Syria. So this gives us an ability to project flexible and, I hope, effective foreign policy, especially in Syrian file. With this, I will not maybe continue. I will pass microphone to our distinguished guest, Mr. Riad HADDAD, Ambassador of Syrian Arab Republic in Russia. My name is Maria Hodynskaya. I am employee of the Russian Foreign Ministry, Department of Strategic Planning. Thank you.
أيها الإخوة الحضور، السادة الزملاء، يسعدني حضور هذه الندوة الهامة والتي يقومها مشكورا معهد العلاقات الدولية الحكومي في موسكو MGIMO.
Уважаемые коллеги, участники и организаторы, я рад присутствовать на этом важном симпозиуме.
Dear colleagues, I'm very glad to take part in this forum. Today's dialogue is very important as it's focused on the format of interregional interaction in the Middle East, where interregional relations are characterized by instability and outbreaks of conflicts. That's why it's very important to discuss reasons for this instability. First of all, the interference of foreign powers. the so-called powers, the United States and other countries, resort to hybrid wars and managed in 2003 invaded Iraq, then using color revolutions or Arab Springs and resorting to terrorist groups created by the United States, pursued policy which was of interest in the interest of the United States. Our country has witnessed this method of war. The domineering powers unleashed terrorism in Syria in order to destabilize the country, to destroy the country, and to destabilize the whole region. And this policy has been pursued by the United States and its allies since 2003. Moreover, new methods of American war are economic ones, and they are aimed to destroy the whole countries and even regions. And they use these methods to destroy and undermine regimes that do not obey the United States. And in order to contain other countries, for example, Russia, Iran, and the European countries, to contain them and to restrain their playing an active role. This is an economic terrorism. It ties up all the foreign trade operations to dollar, and it weakens the economies of other countries, and it's one of the reasons for instability and tensions in the Middle East. That's why the dialogue on new international order that would lead to stability should be based on the respect of international law by all actors. We should also stress the constructive role played by the Russian Federation in the creation of a system based on mutual respect and sovereignty, and the abandonment of interference into other countries' domestic affairs. I'd like to express my deep gratitude to the authorities of Russia, the armed forces, and the Russian people for the support of the Syrian people against terrorism and foreign interference. And in conclusion, I'd like to stress that Syria will continue its fight against terrorism in all its forms in order to eliminate it and wipe out from our territory. we are determined to fight against invaders, whether they are Turkish or from the United States, and to liberate our land. On the other hand, we are moving in a political track in the direction of restoring the country's assets, structures, and stability. And our primary objective is to restore the regional stability. And in conclusion, I'd like to take advantage of this opportunity and to thank MGIMO's authorities for the organization of this very important event.
Much, Your Excellency. There were a couple of very important points mentioned in the speech of His Excellency, and I would like to turn a special attention to the dimension of sanctions. Sanctions which we consider as illegitimate and which really make the Syrian ordinary people suffer. For example, there is sort of a restriction of the import of certain drugs and medicaments into Syria, and people who suffer from cancer, and that's what we saw with our own eyes, cannot get the necessary treatment. I don't think that corresponds with international humanitarian law. And it's very important that the sanctions are lifted as soon as possible. And the second is reconstruction, which has to start in Syria with the help of international organizations, including the United Nations, in which the funding for that reconstruction cannot bear any preconditions, any politicization. It's very important. Thank you very much. And next speaker in the list is Maxim SUCHKOV, Senior Research Fellow at MGIMO Laboratory for International Trends Analysis. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Dear colleague, just for the sake of time, let me quickly go to some of the main points that I was going to make. Over the last few years, kind of a central issue that's been dominating the discourse on Russian policy in the Middle East, especially among the Western colleagues, is whether Russia has a strategy in the Middle East or it does not have a strategy. It is a merely opportunistic type of approach to the region and to Syria in particular. I think that the very question is rooted in the need to understand why Russia has been successful this far in the region, which makes sense. And but to a large degree, it's an erroneous question because it doesn't really matter, or perhaps it's not because Russia had a strategy that others do not that Russia has been successful. If that makes sense. That said, and I will explain that point later in my talk, that said, I think that Russian policy in the Middle East so far has been the most successful foreign policy track for Moscow of all the policy tracks it has pursued. This is exactly where you see, resources, you see initiativeness, you see political creativeness, you see ability to kind of juggle between diplomatic and military measures. You see a lot of, personal involvement on the part of the leadership, and these are kind of all of the makings of why Russian policy in the Middle East has been successful this far. It has changed, however, when it started, when Russia's rise to the region started with a little earlier actually than the Syria campaign, but when Russia made the decision to intervene in the conflict in Syria, its policy was, in my view, based on primarily threat-based. The three types of threat: one, the threat of ISIS, the terrorist organization banned in Russia and many other countries, as it was expanding. The second threat to the Syrian government that was hard pressed by militant opposition groups, terrorist organizations, and their foreign backers. And the third type of threat was on part of kind of Russia's own problem with the West over, over the conflict in Ukraine and the threat of the so-called isolation, political isolation from the West. In a few years after Russian involvement in Syria, this threat-based approach has given way to opportunities-based approach, because the threats that I've just mentioned were no longer in the place. There were no longer threats of immediate toppling of President Assad. There was no longer a threat of territorial expansion of the terrorist organization, even though, its remnants and its capability to attract people are still there. And there were no longer threat of Russia's isolation on part of the West, because many European nations, to a lesser extent the United States maybe, but many European nations and a lot of regional nations were flirting Moscow with different proposals on their own conflicts, on their own problems. The core of that, I think, why Russia's reasonably been more successful than that, is also rooted in the initial perceptions that many had towards Russia when Moscow decided to launch a military campaign in Syria. And the perception was rather low, and many expected Russia to fail, because the three primary kind of benchmarks against which it compared had to do with Russia being compared to the United States, and Russia being compared to the Soviet Union, and Russia being compared to Russia's own resources. And on all of the three accounts, you look at it and you expect Russia to be less powerful than the United States, Russia less powerful than the Soviet Union, and Russia lacking resources to carry out the policy it was going to achieve. But still, for some reason, somewhat miraculously, all of these predictions failed, at least until now. And I think the reason to that is, one, that both the European Union and the United States, to a large degree, did not have their own kind of well thought out comprehensive strategy, and were in many ways, doing things that ultimately didn't bring the results that they initially sought. But perhaps most importantly, because Russia was more strictly adjusting to a number of principles it executed in its foreign policy in regards to the Middle East. And I think of all of them, I would particularly single out three. One is that Russia tried to keep neutrally good relations with most important stakeholders in the region, be it state level or non-state actors. The second principle, actually the one that comes from the medical treatment, do not cause further harm. Right? This is the principle that I think is tried to follow, and all of the conflicts participated. Just ensure that whatever you do, it does not exacerbate the development of the conflict. And the third principle is actually an interesting one, because I think Russia tried to position itself as an alternative that for a long time was lacking in the Middle East, as a political alternative, as a security alternative, kind of an alternative offshore balancer. And I think the years since Russia's involvement in Syria were, in a way, had to do with the kind of pursuit of what kind of alternative is there. And I think the overarching principle of the American foreign policy, for instance, including to the region, could be framed as, the United States is kind of implicitly saying, do as we do and you will be like us. The European Union, in turn, says, be like us and you will be with us. Whereas Russia's principle is be with us and you will stay yourself. And these are kind of three dramatically different approaches, right? Where Americans are saying, if you do like we do, you will, quote unquote, Americanize and things like this. And the European approach is more like, share our values and then you will be kind of embraced or accepted into civilized democratic society, whereas Russian principle is like, if you stay with us, you will be able to preserve your own, identity and values and things like this. And this, in a way, this is a story that is still there. It is perhaps, if you debate me on that, I'll perhaps agree with you that it may not necessarily be like crystallized just yet. But I will end on a note and say that of all the successes, and I think they should be given duly credit, the Middle East politics, as we see it today, is very turbulent, and many argue that we may be in for a new rise of uncertainty in the region with things happening in Iraq and Lebanon, with a lot of uncertainty in Libya and other places. So to me, I personally read the Middle East politics more like a casino gambling, where you can make accurate bets and make wins, but at a certain point you may make a bet and then that may fail all of your achievements. And this gives you kind of a cold shower in a way that you really need to be careful about how you pursue certain things and how you approach your partners. I'll just end up on this note, and perhaps we can engage in more discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Maxim, for this brilliant intervention. I would maybe add that Russia says, be with us and you will be able to preserve your identity. Maybe Russia says, let's be together and we will preserve our identity. I mean, it's if you look at organizations like BRICS, for example, you can see that, the equality is very important for the new formats of the future. Anyway, thank you very much again, and let me pass the mic to Mr. Oktay Tanrisever, a professor at the Middle East Technical University from Turkey. Thank you very much. Please.
First of all, I would like to say that I'm very thankful to the invitation for being in this very prestigious institution. I would like to share my ideas in accordance with the panel description as prepared by the organizers. There are basically two parts of the panel description. In the first part, nature of and the prospects for Russia's engagement with Middle East, and the second one, nature of and prospects for Russia's relations with regional actors in promoting orderly relations. And I will focus on Turkey and try to explain this topic from Turkey's point of view. Of course, I'm an academic expert. I will give my objective view, expert view, but also include the official view and discussions, because you would be also interested in knowing that. In the first part, I will have 3 points, and in the second part, I will also have another 3 points to make. When we look at the nature of and prospects for Russia's engagement with Middle East, yes, as the chair and also Professor SUCHKOV mentioned, Russia has the most successful policy in the region, and it has good relations with almost all actors in the region, and even if they have conflicting policies. I would like to explain why this is the case first. I think this is the case because just before the Arab Spring, or so-called Arab Spring, it was only Russia which stated that we need to stick to conventional rules of international relations, meaning that state-centric, state sovereignty, and non-interference should be adopted. Why this was the case? Because in 2000s, Russia experienced problems emanating from color revolutions in Eurasia, and thought that this repetition of that in Middle East is not good for Russia and for the region. And it turned out that Russia was right. And Western countries, which initially supported Arab Spring, Europeans and the United States, later revised their policy and came to the conclusion that this was not a sound policy and it needs to be changed. So it is normal to stay on the right course, because it was only Russia which claimed that this transition process was not good for the region, and the fact that it failed made Russia appear as a successful country with a successful policy, and this breakage enabled Russia to develop constructive relationship with all parties. The second, whether this is sustainable or not, because all countries would prefer to have good relations with everybody. This is an ideal situation, but this is also too good to be true for all countries, because it is difficult. My answer to this sustainability of the situation is yes, in the short run, difficult in the long run. Yes, why? Because the differences, it is the differences among the local actors and the international global actors that enable Russia to maintain this position. And pragmatism, as our chair mentioned, is the key to success. Because in such a complex environment, you need to have flexible policy, pragmatic policy, and Russia has been pursuing this policy successfully. But in the long run, it is very difficult for two reasons. First, Russia needs to, first of all, decide on the importance of Middle East for its overall foreign policy. We don't know that yet because for Russia, the post-Soviet space is the priority area and also Greater Eurasia, but Middle East is far away from Russia, and there are some opportunities for Russia. Probably Russia's engagement with region will remain very selective and limited to areas that are important for Russia's self-interest. So it is very unlikely for Russia to develop regional strategy for Middle East in the long run comparable to Soviet Union. This is also quite important point because this long-term role of Russia in this region will determine its relations with different actors in the region, because whether it will prioritize Israel or Saudi Arabia or Turkey or Egypt or Iran or this country or that country, it all depends on the long-term vision. So it remains to be seen. So in Turkey, Russia is considered to be a key partner for stabilizing the region, and Astana process played very important role in containing the negative implications of this crisis, and I think it also provided basis for Geneva process and successful conclusion of this conflict became a possibility when the prospects were quite negative. Now some sort of solution, if not solution, but conflict management is likely. Both Turkey and Russia have similar approach to the region. They believe that the state security is important. State-centric approach is taken by both countries, and this enables Turkey and Russia and also other partners in the region to focus on these traditional aspects of security. Instead of conflict resolution, they focused on conflict management, which is easier to achieve. And for them, I think the biggest challenge, as far as I could see, is to avoid this frozen conflict scenario, which is the case in Eurasia, because the managing conflicts might be easier than resolving them. So this is the prospect for the conflicts in Syria, but also in Middle East. Russia could play important role, not only for security, but also development, for energy diplomacy, and it has been coordinating its activities with other countries in the region. But Russia's policy on terrorism is also quite promising for the region, because terrorism is one of the threats facing all countries, and Russia's commitment to fight terrorism is a factor that brings all actors together and enables Russia to cooperate with them. Another important thing for Turkey is the bilateral relations with Russia. I think some of which have nothing to do with Middle East. It has several aspects. One of them is diplomacy. Turkey and Russia have cooperated closely in diplomacy, Astana process, and also regular meetings between Presidents Putin and Erdogan have been considered successful examples of diplomacy. Another important development is the cooperation in the area of military-industrial complex. This has attracted attention of different actors, especially the sale of S-400s. This has also created problems between Turkey and United States and other European allies. Another important thing is energy trade. The Turk Stream is going to be opened very soon, and and also there are other energy projects, and all of these are drivers, including tourism and trade. So bilateral relations are likely to flourish in all aspects in future, and both countries have a enormous potential in expanding bilateral relations. When we look at the third topic, the other issues or regional issues, we cannot say that the other issues are easy to handle, but there is some potential to manage these relations. Of course, Turkey will remain a NATO country. This is confirmed by Turkish leaders and the NATO members. Russia considers Turkey's new role in NATO as both opportunity and also risk, because Russia and China consider all NATO countries quite with some kind of distance. This is likely to color Turkish-Russian relations in future. Another important thing about these Turkish-Western relations is that it also creates some opportunities for Russia, because Turkey, when we look at Turkey's policies on Ukraine, in different regional issues, Turkey follows the Western line, but with its own characteristics. And it enables Russia to have some channel for communication to the West at times when Western countries don't pay attention to Russian interest or the positions. So Turkey, together with some other countries, tries to engage Russia with Western institutions, because Turkey's position and Russian position vis-à-vis EU look similar, because both of them remain at the edges of Europe, and core European countries think that they don't belong to Europe. But they are part of this greater Europe anyway. So closer cooperation and coordination between Turkey and Russia will contribute to stability in this broader European space, and it could also consolidate this the Western security institutions in a way that would maybe enable Western actors to compete with the Chinese, or to cope with the Chinese challenge better. So the dialogue among President Trump President Putin and Erdogan is quite noteworthy. They agree on a number of things, and one of the things seem to be this coordination for handling this new challenges that might also include the challenge coming from China. So to conclude, I would like to say that these Turkish-Russian relations shouldn't be considered as something at the expense of their relations with the West. To the contrary, these relationships should be strengthened so that the Western space should be enlarged to include these countries, and Western security should be enhanced through these partnerships. And I'm very optimistic about that kind of prospect. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor. And I would like to, I can't but agree with what you've said about the pragmatism as a driver for the Russian and Turkish cooperation, especially on Syria. Let us remember that we had difficult moments and ups and downs, especially the incident with the Russian plane that was hit and one of the pilots was killed. But pragmatism let the two leaders overcome that crisis. And by the way, the Russian-Turkish agreements were very effective. If you compare them, for example, with the Russian-US agreements the year before 2016 on the ceasefire in Eastern Aleppo, we didn't work. They didn't work. Why? Because Turkey has influence on the ground. Turkey it's a huge regional player, very important, prominent regional player, and has influence on the ground. If you remember Russian-Turkish agreements on the ceasefire, I think January 2017, Russian-Turkish agreements, memorandum on the escalation of Idlib, Russian-Turkish memorandum agreement, recent agreements on the northern east Syria. All of the three documents, they work, because both countries have political will, both countries have influence on the ground, and both countries are driven by pragmatism. If we look at that issue with a simplistic eye, if I may put it this way, we can say that Russia and Turkey have had different agendas on Syria, but that was not a hindrance for pragmatic cooperation. Thank you very much. And next speaker is Georgi Machitidze, analyst at the MGIMO University of International Studies. Thank you.
Спасибо за предоставленное слово.
Thank you for giving the floor to me. I would like to say that the scale of global uncertainty is a bit exaggerated. Why so? Because the world is still developing, there is no chaos, and most countries can be governed. Is it true that some of the events of the recent past were that uncertain? And I'm talking about the Middle East. I believe that we could forecast the consequences of the Arab Spring that was first manifested as protests in some Middle Eastern states and then led to upheavals. Back in September 2011, Ammar al-Zawahiri, the leader of Al-Qaeda, said that he was supporting the Arab Spring, and he said that it would bring the true Islam. The Arab Spring stimulated sectarian conflict in Syria that led to an all-out war, which was exploited by Islamic radicalists. But nowadays, as you know, there is no quasi-state of ISIS in Iraq and anywhere else in the Middle East, but the Syrian situation hasn't stabilized. It is true that the Syrian government controls most of the country, but there are still areas in which they don't control some territories. And now the policy does not contribute to eliminating all the threats as soon as possible. So at first I want to comment about the certainty and uncertainty of actions of most players, Russia, Turkey, Iran, and the United States. As we can see, in the near future, Moscow will stick to what I call the flexible multi-vector policies, which gives it a lot of advantages. And Russia will continue building bilateral relations and will continue working according to the Astana format, and will maintain its military relations with the United States. As for less important actors that influence the situation in Syria, they will keep their relations with Israel, Egypt, and Saudi Arabia. At the same time, Russia will assist the Syrian forces in Idlib in their fight against radical groups. As you know, the ceasefire does not apply to terrorists. Therefore, Russia's policy in Syria will be clear, flexible, and non-confrontational, and quite predictable as well. Turkey's policy in Syria can also be called predictable. And the statements that Mr. Erdogan makes are usually implemented, and Ankara sticks to the agreements that it makes bilaterally, and also sticks to the agreement with Russia on the security in the north of Syria. But at the same time, Ankara has their own agenda on Idlib, and they are planning to take away from the control of Hayat Tahrir al-Sham and give it to the control of the Syrian National Army. The population is also changing because there are many refugees, and of course there can be different issues in the relations between Russia and Turkey and Iran, and at the same time, we still face the threat of provocations from some Kurdish armies in the northeast of Syria, which can make Ankara make unpredictable decisions in spite of the current agreements with Russia. And here we just hope for the wisdom of two leaders, Erdogan and Putin. As for Iran's policy in Syria, it is also quite predictable, and Tehran plays an important role in financial help to Damascus, and it helps fighting terrorist groups. As for counterterrorism, as for fighting against ISIS, the Shiite militia formed by Iran played an important role, but at the same time there can be a conflict of interests that can bring new uncertainty into the geopolitical situation. Iran and Russia can have different ideas on the future of Syria, and it is important to understand what role Syria plays in the strategic interest of both states, because it is logical that Iran thinks of Syria as an important chain of the Shiite belt in the region. And Israel's reaction can also be unpredictable. We also believe that there might be competition between Russia and Iran for spheres of influence in Syria, and mainly I'm talking about the economy. But we can still say that both Iran and Russia are trying to reach their own goals in Syria by using mutual efforts. But I believe that the least predictable player is the United States. Now there is no direct confrontation between Russia and the US because there are very well-established military relations. And there was an agreement with the American military when refugees were evacuated from the American zone of interest. And about 17,000 people were evacuated, but tens of thousands of people are still there. The U.S. actions are unpredictable because it is unclear whether it's going to withdraw part of the army or not, how they're going to treat the participants of terrorist groups that are still under their control, and whether they're going to use white helmets for provocations again. It is unclear what's going to happen to natural resources deposits. So I believe that the U.S. strategy is too uncertain, and it can contribute to further uncertainty in the whole Syrian situation. But so the question is, can we build a stable order in Syria, and can we achieve stability of all players? Why is this question important? The situation in the Middle East determines the future of the whole system of international relations, maybe not 100%, but to some extent. And what's going on in the Middle East shows the deep crisis of security all over the world. So it means that the system should be reformed, but no one knows how to do it in current circumstances. The problem is that after Arab Spring, there were no stable political systems in the Middle East, and there is also no system of multilateral institutions of regional security. So it is impossible to build a balance in the region and build a system of security based on it. And regional players cannot even build a united front against international terrorism. And it will be impossible to disarm the states of the Middle East, and the US alone will not be able to provide security in the whole region. Therefore, there might be a pessimistic scenario as well, which implies a long period of instability and uncertainty. But in order to keep the stability of most countries of the Middle East, we need a transitional period. And during this period, a number of external players like Russia, the United States, China, EU countries, maybe some of the regional players could become the sponsors of the stability in the region. They could work out the rules of the game, and then based on this, we could be able to settle the crisis in the region. Thank you very much for your attention. Thank you very much.
In-depth speech. I would like to open the floor for exchange, for questions and answers. Yes, please. If I may ask to introduce yourself. Thank you very much.
I'm Shoaib Khan. I'm associated with the Center for Central Eurasian Studies, University of Mumbai. I have only two small comments. Americans like homework in their policy before carrying out their policy. We have seen the world is asking questions. After Saddam Hussein, what in Iraq? After Gaddafi, what in Libya? Had Russia never backed Bashar al-Assad? So after Bashar al-Assad, what? Do they have any plans to replacement? They just create chaos there. We have seen in Afghanistan, on the name of terror, if you see, in Syria, the opposition forces which the Americans are supporting against Bashar al-Assad, they have ISIS and Al-Qaeda elements openly. If not through war, through sanctions or trade wars, they are losing allies daily. 3 allies, Iran, Turkey, Pakistan, they were frontline allies in the Cold War. Iran already lost, Pakistan half lost, Turkey's tilt is also being experienced towards Russia. Professor Oktay said once, yes, of course, blame is on Iran for spreading Shia terror all over the world. And there is a sanction on Iran. Is there any sanction on Saudi Arabia for spreading the Wahhabi ideology all over the world, right from South Asia to Caucasus? It has been experienced. But there are draconian laws similar to the ISIS, but no pressure, nothing on Saudi Arabia. One sentence Professor Oktay said, Russia is far away from Middle East. So even America is far away from Middle East. And I think Russia is more closer in compared to the Americans. Russia's action in Syria is also a message to the other Gulf countries that it can flex its muscles anywhere. And militarily, as well as even in business, if you see, for the last couple of years, Russian companies, energy companies have been active in Arab countries and all. And Arab countries still are also coming towards Russia. They are no more away from Russia. We have seen the first visit of King Salman was to Russia. Only 2 small comments.
Does somebody want to comment on that?
I have a small question. I have a small question to Maxim and you also, right? Russia and China are supporting Syria in West Asian crisis from a very long time when it has started. Now, but last several weeks we have been observing that UN Security Council is discussing the deliver humanitarian aid across the border and conflict lines to more than 1 million Syrians, affected Syrians, in mainly rebel-held areas. This year sponsors are Germany, Belgium, and Kuwait, and they circulated the draft recently. I hope you know that, and circulated draft recently that has been discussed also, and that would add a new crossing point in Turkey, and extend cross-border operation for a year. But Turkey is not cooperating with the United Nations, and what Russia and China feel that this is a violation of human rights first, and this is a violation of international laws also. And in that context, I would like to ask you both, is it just to help affected Syrians, will Turkey will open its border for it?
Also a question on China. My name is Eleonora Tafur. I work for the Italian Institute for Political Studies. It was a question triggered by Oktay-Hoxha's remarks on the Chinese challenge, and I would like both Oktay-Hoxha and Maxim to comment on China's vision for the Middle East. Does it have a vision? Because we hear of the increasing willingness to get involved in the Syria's reconstruction, but do you think that China will live up to its ambitions there?
Thank you. Maybe we collect the 3 questions and then take the others. Just a quick comment from myself before I give the microphone to esteemed colleagues. Churchill used to say that Americans will definitely take a right decision before they've tried all the wrong ones. Why am I saying that? Because the question was about, does Russia have any post-Assad strategy candidates? This is not our style, if I may say so.
No, my question is not about
but
Americans don't have any strategy. They want Bashar.
I got the question. What I'm trying to say is that we should be very careful with the nations, and the people should determine themselves. I know it sounds like a slogan, but this is how it should be. People by themselves should decide on important pillar issues that is connected with the statehood, with the destiny of the state. As for you said about Saudi Arabia, and I mean, there are certain things that everyone knows and understands, but we as Russia, and I'm saying that as a Russian diplomat, we are not somebody who provides naming and shaming. This is not our style as well. So even if you look at the Human Rights Council sessions, and we have some colleagues here who have witnessed Human Rights Council sessions, we are against naming and shaming. We are for uniting countries around certain principles and encouraging them to embark on that principles rather than, pointing figures on those who are good or bad students. But anyway, thank you very much. On Turkey, I just would like to remind you that there is a resolution, Security Council, UN Security Council resolution, cross-border access, which is in action and which Turkey implements. And through designated cross points or checkpoints at the Syrian-Turkish border, humanitarian aid, UN humanitarian aid, and UN-marked NGO humanitarian aid goes to Syria. So just to, thank you very much. And
I would like to answer 3 questions. First of all, clarifications about your remark. Yes, in my presentation, when I said that Russia is far away from this region, in terms of the level of its commitment to the region. Yes, United States is even far, far away from the region, but its level of deployment is very high. Maybe the highest level of deployment and all sorts of influence from military to economy and energy-wise is great. So in the Middle East, United States, the U.S. engagement is not comparable to any other country. Britain comes probably second. For Russia, post-Soviet space seems to be the main area of concentration. In that region, Russia is the most committed country. So that was not the geographical, but in terms of level of influence and commitment. But Russia might decide to increase that commitment. It is up to Russian decision makers, but this is my observation about the current situation. So far, Russia hasn't made such a decision. It has focused on its specific interests. So this is what I said in my presentation.
Yeah, during the Soviet times, there was activity in the Middle East, the Soviet activity. But after disintegration, after 91, Russia was completely almost out of Middle East. Now, Russian intervention in Syria, the world began to see Russia as a power in Middle East to balance the American hegemony. So that they expect now.
Yeah, but it remains to be seen. I mean, it is not comparable to Russian influence in post-Soviet space. So it could cooperate with other actors, agree on different settlements. We don't know that yet. So regarding your question about the cross-border relations, I think Turkey coordinates its activities vis-à-vis Syria with both Russia and United States, members of the UN Security Council, and with Russia, Turkey has a mutual, and also with the Syrian authorities, there is a reference to Adana Memorandum of Understanding, which says that Turkey has a legitimate right to pursue terrorists if it was attacked by these groups. So it is not against human rights, because Turkish authorities for several times noted that it is not against any ethnic group or any community in Syria. Its main interest lies in ensuring its border security and its own protection. So far, United States and Russia confirmed that Turkey's security concerns are important, and I don't think that there was this kind of discussion. Regarding Eleonora's comments on China, so my point about China was a bit more systemic issue, and the possibility of ground cooperation among United States, Russia, and Turkey as a stabilizing network of cooperation for the region. This is a possibility. This could really have some transformative impact on the region. Chinese influence in Middle East is quite limited so far, but that policy is more about global issues. So if there is a kind of U.S.-Chinese rivalry at the global level, if there was such a scenario, we are talking about a scenario, and the U.S.-Russian-Turkish partnership, that scenario might really have a significant impact on this Chinese challenge. NATO recently identified China as a threat for the first time in its final decisions. And Russia is a European country. Turkey is also a European country, even if they are not members of the EU, but they are part of this greater Europe in that sense. So my point was about strengthening ties among US, Russia, Turkey, of course, European countries would consolidate security in Western institutions, maybe promote secularism, democracy, and other Western values and institutions in different parts. This is a possibility. We shouldn't always think in terms of Russia against the West or West against Russia type of thinking. All these countries come together, and we have seen these fruitful dialogues among President Putin, President Trump, President Erdogan. That kind of dialogue could be one of the alternatives which might contribute to global peace and stability. But I'm not saying that this is a policy. It is just one of the scenarios. It remains to be seen.
Really quickly, let me first tackle the issue of Russia-China engagement in the Middle East. So I think there are two drivers for both Russia and China in the Middle East, that is security and in opportunity. For Russia, the initial driver is security, and by establishing itself as a quote-unquote new security guarantor of the region, it tries to grow, political, economic, and other opportunities. For China, initially the driver is investment in other opportunities, because China is a big economy. It needs energy resources, and the Middle East is a huge export market for it. But it cannot continue to receive all of the things it wants to receive from the Middle East without duly security. So for them, so there's these two elements, but they're just organized differently for both countries. The second point, I would say, both are concerned with the so-called, with what they perceive destructive foreign interference, right? With the toppling government type of things. These are both of concern, both to Russia and China. So preserving the regional order and destruction of statehood in the region is important for both. Thirdly, both are concerned with the rise of terrorism. Both have their own kind of domestic elements that radicalize the population. So cooperation on that front is obviously important. Both, however, have different toolkit, right? China has a lot of, this policy on aid and investments, things that Russia simply cannot afford to do. But Russia has other things in its pocket, which I mentioned in my presentation, like having relations with decent relations with all the parties, being actually softer and in its approach. China pursues a different strategy by, Russia is focused on working with the leaderships as well as populations. China is focused more on kind of investing in certain things and building relationship beyond people and beyond leaderships, which to a certain degree may be a kind of a more sustainable type of engagement, but time will tell. I would just mention that Russian and Chinese interests are not necessarily 100% aligned. Just a reminder that China supported Russia only 6 times out of 12 on the U.S. Security Council resolutions that Russia vetoed. So these are entirely there. But so far, I think both need one another because of the two things that I've mentioned, the security and opportunity things organized differently. A few things on Turkey. Richard Haass, the president of the Council on Foreign Relations in the United States, once argued that I think it's a really interesting way to frame the relationship between Russia and Turkey. So Richard Haass argued that Turkey is an ally of the United States, but not a partner. So for Russia, I think it's exactly the opposite. Turkey is a partner, but not an ally. In a way, it makes you more free of different, of expectations. You don't expect them to act like your ally. They definitely have their own interests, will disagree and stuff, but you build your relationship on quote-unquote pragmatic partnership, and that makes it, when there is pain, it makes it go easier than, the type of thing that the United States and Turkey are going through.
Thank you, Maxim. Yeah. Haydar, and then.
Look, I really hate to be between you and coffee break. It's my first observation is that we've heard a lot about Syria, we've heard about Turkey, neighboring countries. Look, as I understand, we were expected to talk about towards new regional order. Regional order, not local, national orders, because I understand we all want to solve Syrian, Libyan, Yemeni, other conflicts. But the thing is that the initial idea about making this panel was to see Middle East as a regional case, and where will it be, let's say in a decade or in 2 decades. The thing is, when we say towards new regional order, first of all, opposite to old regional order or current regional order, what is it? What is old regional order in the Middle East? When, if we go back to the times of the Cold War, it was divided between those who were partners or allies, now regardless of the Soviet Union or of the Western Bloc. Syria and neighboring Jordan were never in the same position or in the same camp. Iraq and neighboring Gulf area were never in the same camp again. And when we say regional order, what are we talking about? And here I have this observation that Maxim said Russia is, not obsessed, but is looking more at the security of the region, China, economy, investment. The thing is, if countries of that region, and unfortunately I don't see any Arab representatives here because ambassador. Syrian embassy. I really wanted to hear from Arab professionals, from those people in the region, how do they see their own region in a decade or in 2. Now, what I was about to say is that we could stabilize Syria jointly or in a different manner. We could solve Libyan, Yemeni issue. The question is, what next? Because you couldn't sustain the situation in any countries, in any country if economic and social situation goes this way, as we see it right now. And what happened in Lebanon and in Iraq shows us that even without having a difficult internal conflict in the country, things can just blow up in your face. And what do we do about it? Because economic development, sound economic development, as we know it, at least in our part of the world, isn't there. Demographic situation is aggravating. Because of new communications, what's new is that generation who is 17, 21, they see on screens of their phones how people live in Europe, how people live in the Western world, and they say, look, I want this right now. I'm not going to wait. And they're not having it. They're not getting it. And in fact, as I understand, the sense is we will never get it. Because if anybody understands how things develop in the Arab region, they will never get it. But they want it. And so this creates this instability that nobody can solve from outside. We can jointly, hopefully, inshallah, solve military or paramilitary conflicts. But we cannot impose development on these countries. And if they don't have sound development with sound social contract between peoples and the government, crisis, which is like plural from crisis, will keep on going and going and going, and we will be just, trying to put down those fires. And I think I'll stop here. It was just my observation on what we needed to discuss here instead of talking how cases of Syria and some others could be solved. Thank you.
A follow-up to Aidar's talk. Yulia Nikitina, MGIMO University Center for the Post-Soviet Studies. It seems to me that none of the speakers mentioned Russian concept of collective security for the Persian Gulf suggested by Russia this summer. So I would be very interested in knowing the reaction of the speakers to this conception, because the reaction might be similar to the Russian suggestion on the draft European Security Treaty in 2008. So it seems like we have one more great concept, but what about reality? Does anyone discuss it at all? It seems that the speakers even don't consider it important to mention about that. So that's my thanks.
No, I mean, it's definitely important. I mean, I did a video for the EME on the YouTube. It should be there exactly on that thing. It's just, I think, we devoted so much time talking about that issue in the fall, including with the distinguished diplomat at Riad. And you're absolutely right. We should have mentioned that. Perhaps we would have just started off with it. It just was my personal. I can't speak for the rest of it. It was just that it was clear enough. Definitely, I think the one that, as people present here obviously know, this wasn't Russia's first proposal of the concept, right? The proposal at the end of 1990s in 2004 and 2006. But now I think there was this feeling that the moment was right, given all the turmoil in the region, given the American policies in the region, given the perception the American policies in the region received. The moment was right also because of Russia's own rising profile in the region and the perception that Russia is the one that can deliver the new regional order. And in my view, it reflected actually two things. One, and kind of divided into two parts. One had to do with the laundry list of things that Russia felt were wrong with the region, where the things were disbalancing the regional order. And the second one were a number of principles that should guide the new regional order, and two, the number of concrete practical initiatives how to kick off the process. So basically, I think it was really great that in that particular document there were concrete proposals such as, the process should be taken step by step. Nobody expects progress or everyone embrace the initiative the next day it's put out there. But there were concrete proposals such as security dialogue between regional states and their military doctrines, constant military consultations, measures, trust-building measures, transparency measures. So in a way to introduce the kind of OSCE type of thing to the region. And when I say to the region, it should be noted it was particularly for the Gulf, with the view that if in any way successful, it can be expanded to further the region. And frankly speaking, and obviously, right, in the United States, it was received with a lot of suspicion as a way to further sideline Americans. In Europe, it was, as you remember from our discussion at Riad, the Europeans argued that it would lack legitimacy unless the Europeans are embraced. And in the region, initially, it was perceived with, differently, of course, but now, few weeks ago, actually, a distinguished Iranian diplomat spoke about that initiative and said, actually, after discussing it further with Russian colleagues, they realized that there weren't so many points of disagreement, and in concept, the idea was great. As perhaps as an Iranian diplomat, his skepticism was that the Arab Gulf states are not going to embrace it. Arab Gulf states on their side argued that, again, in principle, conceptually, the ideas are very interesting, but then they think it's Iran's fault and they're not going to embrace it. And I don't think the people who were drafting these concepts were not prepared for this type of reaction. It's understandable, but it's there in the document that they are prepared for this type of reaction. The expectations are realistic. The concrete frame of reference and the way we approach this thing is, stage by stage. And I think it should be there. Perhaps it should sit there for some time until the parties realize that the only alternative to the concept, the one that Russia proposed or similar ones that do not pin the blame to someone, that don't do finger pointing, but are aimed at a comprehensive kind of engagement. The alternative to that is only either continued proxy war or all-out war. This is something the parties say they're not interested in. If you're not interested, then if you're not interested in the war of extrition, then that's your chance to embrace it.
Yeah.
Well, thank you.
Yeah, very briefly.
Yeah, of course.
Very briefly, I would like to say something about the regional order and prospects for stability. I think Middle East is different from other regions. All regions have their own characteristics, and the European integration type of model is not likely for the Middle East. It hasn't been the case there for two reasons. One of them is the region is quite important for its energy resources, and there's great power rivalry over the control over these direct or indirect control of energy resources. So this is one of the factors which makes it difficult to have external agreement on the nature of order in the region. But regional countries and societies have their own socio-cultural problems as well as economic and political difficulties. Some of them tend to be failed states. Some of them have, as you mentioned, major challenges of demography and structural problems, which are difficult to contain. And from the Soviet times, Soviet Union spent lots of resources to the region, and probably Soviet leaders didn't benefit from this kind of investment in the region. And the European view of the region is not different. They see that this region is draining their resources. They put some resources, but they don't get enough. So no major power is interested in devoting their resources to a region where they wouldn't benefit, but they concentrate on this energy geopolitics. So the OSCE type of security measure could work, because states all need some kind of confidence building measures and some kind of dialogue, crisis management. They could all work in this region. Russia, European countries, Turkey, and the regional countries, United States, they all would be supportive of such regional order. But real challenge, as you mentioned, comes from below. Because expectations are high, resources are limited, and external powers don't want to commit their resources. So realistic prospects for future is that this region will be characterized by these ongoing conflicts, but external powers should come up with stronger institutions and strategies for first managing conflicts. This is important, and also dealing with the critical problems. I mean, some of the problems are more important than others. They shouldn't really have disasters like Syrian crisis. I mean, this was a huge crisis, and probably all countries made a mistake, and for what? For nothing. So it was a lose-lose game, and it was not a really good example of diplomacy right from the beginning. I'm talking about the beginning. So even the handling of the regional matters would contribute to the better management of regional problems, and these proxy wars, such great power competition should also be contained. There should be certain rules, certain gentleman agreement, ground bargaining. In the absence of that, even smallest actors, terrorist groups or small political actors, they all have greater influence and they could really lead major actors. So it's a kind of tail wagging the dog, not dog wagging the tail. So that should be different. So the Middle East example could tell us major lessons, and this is the lesson. I think great powers, regional actors should converge their policies and agree on the minimum standards of stability, security, but maximalism may not work. Arab Spring started these maximalist feelings. Arabs believe that their countries will be democratic, very rich, and everything will be solved. It will be like paradise. And then hell was the reality. So realism, I think, is what the Middle Eastern people and the major powers need. And these rivalries over energy should be handled in a through dialogue. Energy diplomacy, I think, is needed for that. Parties should learn to share benefits. Benefit sharing is important in energy, water, environment, and all sorts of stuff. But if we think that it is a win-lose type of game, eventually it becomes lose-lose game. So this is the point that I would like to make.
Thank you very much. I think we had an interesting discussion, though Aydar criticized it as irrelevant, but I still think it was very important. Thank you very much for your contributions, and I propose a coffee break.